Hi, everyone. We're going to give you a minute to start joining us here, and welcome to Equity and Community in Local News, Lessons from 2020. I'm Julie Moose. I'm Executive Director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. I'm really happy to be here with you and with our panelists and moderator and with our partner, PEN America. So we appreciate them being here and we appreciate you being here as well. We're gonna have a great conversation today, and it's gonna start among our panelists, and we want you to participate as well. So please, as soon as you start having questions, go ahead and start posing them in the Q&A queue, and we will get to them throughout the program. And if there are any we aren't able to get to, we'll share them with the panelists after the program and pass along any responses that they have. So I'm proud to introduce our partner in this program, PEN America, and specifically Tom Milia, who is the Washington Director for PEN America. Tom is going to introduce our moderator, and then we will go ahead and get started.
Okay. Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you all for joining us this morning. PEN America is an advocacy organization, among other things, pressing the case on Capitol Hill and around the country for supporting local news gathering in its many innovations and forms. So we're pleased to be co-sponsoring today's discussion with Julie Moose and her colleagues at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. I'm going to turn it over now to Jim Friedlich, who has had an impressive career as an entrepreneur, investor, and innovator in the news publishing sector in the US and around the world. Since September 2016, he's been the CEO of Lenfest Institute of Journalism, a nonprofit enterprise that supports innovations in local journalism across the country, in particular helping major newspapers in urban areas transform to the digital age. So Jim, thank you for agreeing to host this conversation today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and my thanks to Julie as well. It's been very impressive how the National Press Club Journalism Institute has seized the day and convened conversations like this one. This is the nonprofit affiliate of the National Press Club, which goes without introduction. She is a former McClatchy Washington Bureau executive and has a deep news background of her own, and that's reflected in these programs. The topic today is equity and community in local news. Those are words that we hear a lot, and they're sometimes simply cliches, but not well defined in action. What we really want to talk about today is what it looks like when local news organizations take a fundamentally different view of their communities and place the community and their diverse communities at the center of their activity. And we have four terrific exemplars of that principle. There are almost 100 of you on this call. We want to have a conversation and not a presentation, so we'll turn as quickly as we can to Q&A. There is a question and answer function, as Julie mentioned, and we'd love to hear from you throughout. We won't hold questions till the end. We'd like to have a real conversation. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists really quickly. I then have one question for each panelist about their work, and then more general questions for everyone, and then we hope to, again, hear from our audience. Darryl Holliday is the co-founder of City Bureau. City Bureau is a journalism lab on Chicago's South Side. It is renowned for several innovative kinds of work, most notably its open newsroom, its fellowship program, and something called the Documenters Project. And Darryl will explain each of these and how they relate to equity in news. Cassie Haynes is the Philadelphia-based co-executive director at Resolve Philly. Her co-head is Jean Friedman-Rodowski, who I think is also on the call. Resolve Philly is a nonprofit platform that is redesigning how journalists engage with their communities. Resolve Philly leads a collaborative journalism program called Broke in Philly about poverty and economic justice. The play on words is intentional. The systems are broke and many people in Philly are broke. This is a collaboration of 26 news organizations from the Philadelphia Inquirer and WHYY and NBC 10 on down to much, much smaller 1- and 2-person newsrooms in multiple languages around the city. It covers poverty and economic justice in, sadly, America's top 10 poorest city. Lenfest Institute, full disclosure, is a major funder, and we are immensely proud of their work. Tasneem Raja is the editor-in-chief of the Oaklandside, a nonprofit news organization launched just in June 2020. It's funded by members, but principally by the American Journalism Project. It is a sister organization of Berkeleyside and part of a larger entity called Cityside. The Oaklandside was founded after spending months and months of conversation and listening to its communities. That has informed their beat structure, the name itself, et cetera, as Tasneem will describe. Denise Rolark Barnes is the 2nd generation publisher of the Washington Informer, which is a venerable Black-owned newspaper focusing on the Black community in Washington and surrounding counties. It was started by her late father in 1964. She became the publisher in 1994, and she's enlisting the help of her son, whom she hopes will take over the organization for a 3rd generation. She has articulated an optimistic and very enthusiastic vision of a digital and multimedia future that I'll ask her to articulate as well. So my first question is for Darryl. We spoke yesterday, and you said that too often equity remains an undefined catchword. As you said, just the E in DEI, and that's it. How do you define equity, and specifically, how does it relate to your work at the City Bureau?
Sure, I'll try and define it and then hopefully concisely relate it to our work. I do believe that the phrase DEI can often obscure the point, and in some ways it's in the wrong order. Diversity is the easiest of these three because you can count heads, and all white, all male newsroom hires women, Black folks, and that's diversity, right?
Right.
Inclusion is more of like a mindset. I think about curb cuts, for example. 80 years ago, we didn't have them. Disability rights advocates fought for them, and now they're ubiquitous. Equity, I would say, is when your identity doesn't define your outcomes. So curb cuts are an equitable outcome that everyone benefits from. Moms with strollers, older folks with walkers, me on my run, whatever. I think the real point is that we'd be really wise to consider what curb cuts look like in the news industry, so to speak. That's a metaphor, but I mean, how do we design newsrooms that work better for everyone? Because the cost of inequity in our information ecosystems has real consequences, and it has real costs. Communities are harmed when newsrooms are whiter, more male, wealthier in the areas that they cover. When the attention paid to Black communities is just through crime coverage. We're late on, I think, realizing the full potential of healthy information ecosystem. At this point, it begins with equity. So I feel like I've been rambling for a bit. I'm happy to talk more about how it goes to our programs, but also happy to pass it on to colleagues.
When we spoke yesterday, you had a kind of 3-part definition of equity, including acknowledging history, et cetera. Can you define that?
Sure.
And then I'll turn to Cassie for her views.
Yep, absolutely. First, I want to thank the many Chicago organizations who we worked with as thought partners around that framework. So we think of it in 3 parts, equity as it relates to our work. The first is acknowledging history. The second is shifting power. And the third is embracing accountability. So examples from our programs with acknowledging history, our civic reporting fellowship, which brings emerging reporters together with more experienced journalists, acknowledges that the news industry has ignored and marginalized people of color, Indigenous folks. Such a long list of people who are not part of this megaphone. So we devised a solution to bring these folks into that process, and I think primarily give them support. through pay, through understanding of what kinds of support you should ask for or demand, so that when they get into these industry, newsrooms, they don't just wash out. I think we've seen that over decades, where diversity is prioritized over the rest, and so you bring folks in, you don't give them support, and they wash out. And whose fault is that? So we're really looking to make sure that the people that we bring in understand that and are prepared. Shifting Power, our documenters program, is designed to bring in many more people into the process of producing and distributing information through covering public meetings, but also through building a network of citizens who care about this work and generate more things beyond City Bureau. And lastly, Embracing Accountability. Public Newsroom, I think, is a great example of that. It's a weekly event series, monthly now that we're online, where anyone is able to come into our newsroom literally and think through the processes, challenges, successes, and hold media and us, City Bureau, accountable for our decisions.
Terrific, thank you. Cassie, I think you would, from our past conversations, you would define equity partly in terms of communities being equally informed and having equal access to information and content that with which to inform their lives. In fact, you have a program called Equally Informed, which sprung out of the information needs of the pandemic in Philadelphia, which are extreme. Can you tell us about that? How you moved so quickly and what the various means of news distribution have been and how equity is at the center of that?
Sure can. First, I love this tripartite definition of equity. And I think, I think Resolve certainly our work embodies this. And when you can really operate your work with equity at the center of it, it's inherent in what you do. So I'm happy to talk about equity as it exists in this particular project. And I also just want to call out that when you have this baked into your DNA as an organization, that's a huge part of it, right? It's all the way down to the core. It's how you pay people. It's the benefits that you offer. It's the professional development that you provide your team. That is equity. And I think it's what, it's part of the secret sauce, and it's not a secret, that allows our team to do something like, pivot 90% of our staff capacity to a response to a quickly moving pandemic. So that's the long and the short answer, is that when it's at the core, I think it allows you to do things with that in mind. Equally Informed is a project that indeed came about because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for communities who were most vulnerable to both the physical as well as the social and economic impact of COVID, to the need for greater exchange and engagement around information. And in Philadelphia, there's such a tremendous overlap between those who are most vulnerable to COVID and also those who have the least access to information that is representative, that is truly informative, and that is meeting their needs in spaces where these communities are existing. And so Equally Informed really was developed to address that. We are doing this through a number of ways. This project has iterated over the last few months, really based on a lot of the deep community engagement roots that our team has, and we've been able to build on it in ways that are aligned with our values of equity and transparency. We have we pay people. We are cognizant of our footprint as a resourced nonprofit in Philadelphia, and what that means in terms of how we engage with our partners, both our 26 newsroom partners as well as the community organizations that we partner with.
One of the things that has impressed us for a long time, and I think is is core to your effectiveness is there's a kind of ambidextrous quality to your work, and that, by which I mean you seem to work equally well with larger news partners like WHYY, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and NBC 10, which is Comcast, and the smallest and newest of players like the Germantown Info Hub or the Kensington Voice. You also are ambidextrous in working with technologies like reach and text messaging as a primary engagement tool on the one hand, and then the technology as old as Gutenberg's Bible, a print newsletter that's distributed with food packages to communities in need. So those are things that we can talk more about in a few minutes, but are things I'm sure you'd welcome outreach from people on the phone. Tasneem, you're among America's newest startups. Oaklandside, or the Oaklandside, was launched in June. You were publishing through Berkeleyside and Cityside somewhat before that. And part of this was a very, very intentional effort to reach out to community, listen carefully, have the beat structure and even the name of the organization defined partly through user input. Can you tell us about that and what it means in practical terms?
Absolutely. So, and thank you to everybody on the call. I love hearing from all of you about the work that you're doing and just getting to think about how we could apply those lessons in Oakland. So I really appreciate the opportunity. We started months before we launched the Oaklandside with conversation, just starting with a one-on-one conversation with community stakeholders, artists, educators, activists, librarians, healthcare workers, to say, what do you need to better understand about Oakland, to be able to do the work that you're doing more effectively, to be able to enjoy our beautiful city? And what information do you have to share with our community so that others can better impact and engage with and influence Oakland? And those conversations then started to grow into events, live events, where we were inviting people going to various community centers across Oakland, again, libraries or co-working spaces or senior centers, to just have those conversations on a larger scale. And starting to incorporate translation into those events as well, so that we could start offering that programming in both English and Spanish, and really getting down to brass tacks to say, we weren't starting from what news do you want covered in your city? We often didn't use the word news at all. We really were using the language of information. What information do you need to be able to be the Oaklander you want to be able to help build the Oakland you want to live in? And out of those came a number of foundational decisions that we had to make as a newsroom as we got launched. So for instance, what were we going to cover? And how were we going to cover these beats? We are covering housing and homelessness, education, equity, arts and community, small business, and city hall and policing. And those beats came directly out of our conversations with community members when they said, here's what we need to know more about. Who's covering school board? How do I participate in local government? How do I, questions as small as how do I enter public comment when I am attending a city council meeting, to as large as, the police chief just resigned and I don't really understand why. Can you guys help me understand why that happened? It also, as you mentioned, Jim, it affected our name. We had a community listening process where we said, we understand that Oakland, of course, doesn't have right now a dedicated newsroom that is just covering Oakland. And we see how deeply people miss that. We heard in these community conversations that longing for a newsroom that was wholly dedicated to Oakland, and this name, the Oaklandside, came out of those conversations. The idea that we are here to tell Oakland's side of the story. And it affected our hiring. So our team is majority journalists of color. Half of our core editorial team has lived in Oakland for 10 or more years. And I would say one of the biggest things that came out of those conversations was also a set of founding values that we now apply. We've essentially turned into metrics that we apply to all of our stories. So for instance, an example of that is people told us they are they really want to see more reporting that reflects the value of Oakland. They were tired of reporting on Oakland focusing on what's not working or what we already know is broken. They said, we love this city, we love Oakland, we want to see that reflected in coverage. So in our CMS, in our story budget, we have converted some of these desires, these values that we heard from our community into what we call mission metrics. And we apply those metrics to our story so that we can say, okay, our community told us they want to see journalism that reflects the value of Oakland. They want reporting for Oakland communities, not just about Oakland communities. They want reporting that reshapes harmful narratives about Oakland's communities. So when we are doing our work and making decisions about what to cover, we apply those metrics to our stories and say, okay, this is going to help us guide our coverage. We had intended to do, of course, a lot more live events, a lot more live programming, and the pandemic changed that. You know, we are no longer able to continue that monthly listening series, but we are now figuring out how to pivot that into, you know, into a digital space and be ready to then pivot back to live engagement when it's safe to do so.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn now to Denise. There was a recent story about legacy Black newspapers that said, and I quote, when mainstream media catches a cold, Black media gets pneumonia. This was not just talking about the secular challenges that face most, if not all, local newspapers, but in the wake of COVID, which has been devastating, especially for advertising-dependent news. But you have a very optimistic and clear vision of a multimedia future. You've converted part of the building, as I understand, to a podcast studio, and you're really talking about a digital future for the Washington Informer. Can you tell us about that and why and how you're so optimistic, and what vision you can share with others in similar media?
I'm crazy, Jim, just crazy. And it's a do or die time, excuse me, a do or die time for us. And when you talk about colds and pneumonia, I mean, the Black press, which was started in 1827, can you imagine? You know, we had pneumonia then, because that was almost 50 years before slavery was abolished, and Black people were publishing newspapers at a time when Black people weren't even supposed to know how to read, nevertheless write. So we, you know, have survived as an institution for well over 100 years, and we continue to do so, and we've adjusted. We adjusted to radio, we adjusted to television, we've adjusted to, you know, to these things now, and trying to make sure that we're staying relevant. And for those of us that feel as though, going back to your equity question, that, you know, we play a role in making our communities more equitable, you know, we want to continue to play that role. It's interesting, and I'm glad to hear about the Oaklandside, but there's been a Black newspaper in Oakland, California for many, many years, a couple as a matter of fact. And so there is a local newspaper there. And so what I'm excited about, I mean, I really am, I'm excited by this conversation, and to meet Cassie and Darryl and Tasneem and to hear what they're doing, because we realize that we've had sort of operated in a stagnant manner. I mean, old newspaper, it worked for us then, it should work for us now. But with this next generation that's coming along, that folks have told us don't read newspapers, which we even challenge that. We don't think that's necessarily the case. And when we launched WI Bridge, DC, which is focused on millennials, a publication that my son now runs, we find that whenever there's a story online, if they know that it's in print, they want that print copy. And so there's something there that's sort of, you know, attractive, I think, to all people to have something that's tangible, that tells their story in their own words and connected. So yeah, I'm very optimistic. I'm learning a lot of new things. Publishers all across this country, many of us are working together. We're working with other media organizations, the Local Media Association, the NNPA, Facebook, Twitter, all of these institutions have recognized the importance of promoting and sustaining particularly local newspapers and Black newspapers. And so we're back in school again, front row seats, understanding all the technology that allows us to reach a much broader audience while continuing to inform our aging audience that still very much relies on the news that we've provided them, in our case, for 55 years.
And Denise, I appreciate you pointing out the Oakland Post, and thank you for mentioning their work as well.
At Lenfest, we are the nonprofit owner of the Philadelphia Inquirer, but we work very closely with the Philadelphia Tribune and Mr. Robert Bogle in the digital transition of that venerable property. It is the longest continually operated Black newspaper in the world, we think. And also with Word Radio, which is Sarah Lomax-Reese's family-owned Black talk radio. You have made a particular point about audio, and I was unclear from what I've read whether this is an effort to get into radio or to leverage the growth of audio and podcasting to reach new audiences, or some combination. But if we could spend a moment on that, I think it would be interesting to our audience.
In a very uncomplicated, simple response, my major in undergrad was radio broadcasting. Next to print journalism, I love radio, and I listen to a lot of it. My dad had one of the longest radio talk shows in Washington, D.C. before he died. It was a program called Sound Off that aired every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday night on one of the local radio stations. And whenever he wasn't available, I substituted for him. It was a great way to connect to communities while they're doing whatever else they're doing, but they're listening and learning and being informed. We at the Informer also launched, due to COVID, a weekly broadcast that we do, on internet-based program on, YouTube and Facebook Live, what have you. And we broadcast that every Friday. It's my son's idea, actually, to set up this podcast studio, and it hasn't been completed, so it's not launched yet. But we think that this is a mechanism, and it goes back to some of the things that Cassie said and Tasneem about being able to help communities to tell their own stories. We want to do it to, of course, amplify what we're doing here at the Informer, but more importantly, to teach and to train and to create additional voices coming from what we would call, the disenfranchised. We talked about equity, and a lot of times you talk about equity as it relates to race. For us, it's more of an economic issue. Being in a community that, only has one grocery store, has a failing hospital, has poorly performing schools. All of those issues mean that we have a lot to talk about. And so that's why we're introducing this podcast studio here and just trying to interject more diverse voices into, the global conversation that still impact people in Chicago and Philly and Oakland and Lagos and you name it. I mean, it's happening around the world. So we're it's an exploration right now. We don't have it all figured out, but we are moving forward with it because we feel as though it's a necessary additional tool that we want in our toolbox of providing information and education and entertainment and empowerment.
Thank you. There was a question in the chat or in the Q&A rather, and please do chime in, from John Lippman asking, in effect, what is your relationship with mainstream media? Do they take your stuff or steal your stuff uncredited? Do you collaborate with them? If so, what lessons can be learned? Maybe I'll start with Cassie, who's organization has collaboration at its core. But what is your role in the ecosystem, and what do you need and expect from so-called mainstream media, which have both opportunities and challenges of their own?
Yeah, so we do partner with mainstream legacy institutions in Philly, and we have really excellent partnerships with those institutions. I think we manage a collaborative of newsrooms. Resolve does some, but not much, publishing of its own content. And that which we do publish or disseminate in some way is complementary to and amplifying the content that is actually published by our partners.
John just chimed in to say, do they pay for your content? So maybe you can explain the model.
So the model is
pay for theirs?
It's theirs, and we actually pay for it. We have a collaborative sum of money that the partners have some control over how it gets distributed amongst them, that supports collaborative reporting projects. The pieces of reporting, the acts of journalism that come out of the collaborative that are part of the Broken Philly umbrella of coverage, those are independently edited and published by our partner institutions, with some support from our organization sometimes, not always, right? We have a data journalist on our team who operates as a shared resource and does data journalism capacity building and also actual data journalism for our partners. An example of that is some 911 data that our team is currently analyzing to support various reporting projects that our partners are engaging around. So it's not, they don't pay us to be a member of the collaborative. We do have contractual relationships with them. They are contractually bound to participate in certain ways, to uphold certain commitments in terms of showing up and lending their specific resources to the collaborative. But that's the nature of the relationship.
Got it. I'm curious about investigative news and deep dive, long form investigative content. And maybe this applies best to the Oaklandside as you grow, and to the Washington Informer. But I noticed from the attendee list there are two Pulitzer Prize winning editors on the call: Michael Days, who was the longtime editor of the Philadelphia Daily News, and Gordon Witkin, who was a longtime executive editor of the Center for Public Integrity in Washington. And these are organizations that have significant libel insurance, that have the backing of lawyers and funds to protect themselves and to aggressively pursue news that others don't want to see the light of day. If you think about the Me Too coverage from the New York Times, that was a not so well kept secret for years and years, but no news organization could go toe to toe with Harvey Weinstein and his resources until the New York Times and the New Yorker really took it on. How do you think about that as you scale up, Tasneem? Or is that not your role?
No, it's absolutely been a core plank of our work. And again, coming out of what we know about the needs, the questions that need to be answered in Oakland. I'll share one example, and I neglected to mention our City Hall and policing beat. We don't cover crime, we cover policing at the Oaklandside. So during the first week of protests in Oakland, there was one night where the Oakland Police Department fired less lethal weapons on a large crowd of protesters well ahead of an official curfew that happened that night. There were a number of student protesters in the crowd as well. And the official line was that protesters were beginning to prepare Molotov cocktails to throw at the police line. And so the officers on the line preemptively fired. And this was, this was just accepted largely as fact. But, we had reporters at the scene. We had heard from people at the scene who said, this is just not what happened. We conducted what we called a visual investigation of 50 videos, hundreds and hundreds of photographs, hours and hours of bystander testimony, and knocking on doors to uncover more photos and videos that had not been publicly shared until our report. We found no evidence whatsoever that anybody was preparing incendiary devices to lob at the police line. We found evidence only of what was likely 2 plastic water bottles that were hurled at the line. So, what we heard back from the community was they were just really excited and in need of journalism that was pushing back, more journalism in our community that was pushing back on the official, police and city official narratives. And to this date, it's been well over 2 months since that event, and OPD still has not presented any evidence of, their claims of these incendiary devices. So that's one example of the kind of investigative reporting that we have just taken on, from day one. But we're also really interested in, there's the big flashy news stories, there's the problems that we all know are out there. What's the resource side of the equation? How are we bringing the same skills, experience, resources, energy to filling resource gaps in our community? We want to be able to point out what's not working, what's broken in our systems, obvious cases of corruption and wrongdoing and, false narratives being put forward by people in power. But we also want to say, okay, it's not enough to point out what's not working. How are we also going to help people get access to resources that are going to actually be useful to them, so that we're not just constantly pointing out what's not working in our city, but are helping people, playing a role in helping to be part of the solutions as well.
I think there's a solutions orientation to all 4 of your work. And there's been enormous growth in adherence to the principles of solutions journalism over the past few years. That's been helpful for communities. It has applied to mainstream newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Boston Globe, Dallas Morning News, Minneapolis Star Tribune, Seattle Times, which helped create it, I think, to some significant degree. Denise, do you worry about libel insurance and investigative news exposure? And are there stories that when you hit send, you think this could be the end of us? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know if it's tells where we are as far as storytelling is concerned, but we have not been concerned about it up to this point. It's just making sure that all of the facts are correct when we tell our stories. And then there have not been, that I can think of, probably in the last couple of years, that we've done any real, I would say, serious investigative reporting, primarily because of lack of staff and resources. But I think back to some of our sister publications who, when you ask the question, I just realized that there's this anti-lynching legislation, in Congress that came from years and years and years of investigative reporting from my idol, Ida B. Wells, who started in the late 1800s talking about the lynching of Black men. And as a consequence, it wasn't court, it was firebombing offices and shooting at and trying to kill reporters, which was even worse, I think, than a legal battle. And there's so many movements that we've been involved in that we report on continuously. But from an investigative standpoint, at this point, we have insurance just in case, but we're not too worried yet about anything that we've done, unfortunately, to trigger, any legal action yet.
There's a question from Sally Lehrman about the assault on journalists with respect to fake news and how corrosive that's been, and presumably how to combat it. If anyone, sort of a jump ball, wants to take this on, I would appreciate it. I'll start. I think there's the press has never been more important, never been more valued, at least from the numbers we've seen. And this relates to a question that Tom Melia asked separately. During COVID-19, the digital traffic to the Philadelphia Inquirer and to other major news organizations that we track has, in many cases, been up as much as 5-fold. The previous record in Philadelphia, if you're a Philadelphian, you'll appreciate this, was the Eagles win the Super Bowl. Now it's COVID-19. And this was partly a desperate and an important need for accurate news, and partly that the print paper was either unavailable or people were afraid to go out and get it. So there has been a sharp increase in use of our content. I think Equally Informed and Resolve have found the same thing. That to me says that people still trust branded news or news from their community, whether it's the Washington Informer or the Philadelphia Inquirer or Algia or Philadelphia Tribune or City Bureau. And yet the attacks from the president and from others on fake news, almost all of our reporters say is corrosive, that when a politician doesn't want to answer a question, you're fake news. So it's the internet giveth and the internet taketh away.
I think also, I'll just jump in, Jim, and say that when it came to the advent of this virus coming into our country and infecting Americans, we initially had to face or address this belief that it did not affect African Americans. And then as we began to tell that story became the story that African Americans were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And so, we continue to have to tell that and re-emphasize it in communities like mine, particularly, now it was the story about it didn't affect young people, right? And now we're having to, there's new information that was coming out, of course, every day. So who knows except what the experts or the frontline workers were seeing, but making sure that information got out to our readers or whoever we are focusing upon, our demographic, to make sure that they understand all of the aspects of this virus, and also how it affects us in other ways, in business, businesses that are closing, a lot of them are eyes, people who are losing jobs, our frontline workers who are mostly Black and brown people and who's telling their stories. So, this has really caused us to, I think all media really to look at how we handle a situation that we never thought we would face, and make sure that we get the most honest and factual information out to our readers and viewers.
I wonder how you're all thinking about the election, and by which I mean not only the national election, but local elections in each of your hyperlocal markets. Is this a community engagement opportunity? Are you a partisan presence endorsing candidates or taking one side or another of issues, or are you purely a facilitator? Is it a get out the vote effort or a cover the story effort?
Sure, I'm happy to speak a little bit about how we're going to be approaching local elections in Oakland. So we want to start with, not start with assumptions. We're not going to start with like candidates and, okay, what's going on in this district? We want to start with the fact that a lot of people don't know what district they're in. They don't know if their district has a, has a contested race this cycle. We want to start with, okay, where do you live? So we're building a tool on our site where people can come and the starting point is a question. It's okay, where do you live? All right, here's your district. Do you have a contested race in your district this this
Is
cycle.
this a voter's guide in effect, or?
Yeah, I think you could call it that way, but we're really starting more from just thinking of it as a conversation.
Right.
And the second thing we do at that point is say, okay, let's talk about what you care about in your district. So we start by asking people, you know, again, coming back to information needs, you know, what keeps you up at night, you know, in 5 years, what would you like to see differently in your neighborhood? And when we then take our conversations to the candidates to do, you know, traditional candidate questionnaires, Q&As, interviews, our approach will be directly tied to what we hear from community members in those districts to say, okay, here's what we've heard from, you know, from your constituents. We want to bring that back to, you know, to these candidates. And it's really, going to be interesting, I think, to see, okay, how can we, of course, during the pandemic, reach people who are not going to be, you know, the first people to find our digital surveys. You know, how are we going to do a good job of getting out into our communities in ways that are going to just close, you know, close the gaps when it comes to digital divides that we know are so present in Oakland. So flyering, we're going to be doing a lot of flyering. You know, when I was in Tyler, Texas, I started a small community news site out there. Flyers are really powerful.
Tyler Loop.
Yeah, the Tyler Loop, exactly.
Small but
So
mighty.
yeah, small, exactly. So we're going to be doing a lot of that. And then we really want to get to these questions of just like really basic nuts and bolts. You know, how do I vote? How do I register? What, you know, what deadlines do I need to know about? And again, using flyers to get a lot of that information out there in ways that, you know, in times, you know, different times, not during the pandemic, we would be doing with a lot of live in-person conversation, but we're working with our community, you know, with community organizations across Oakland to identify what are the sort of high traffic areas where flyers and potentially partnering with audio reporters in our community to do some, you know, to gather information through voicemails and through, you know, on the street, safe, distanced audio reporting as well. How are we going to not just rely on digital means to get these questions out there?
Darryl, how do you think about elections? Does the Documenter Project or City Bureau of the Open Newsroom play a role?
Sure. My answer as I was listening to the conversation is similar across the last 3 questions, actually, around investigations, fake news, and the coming elections. I think there are a lot of short-term answers that we could and should approach and tackle, but I also get the feeling sometimes that we're trying to solve the problem with the same solutions. I think that there's a much longer term issue, which is trust in institutions is just going down across the board for many good reasons. And that's the problem that I think we'll just need to sit with and requires like a focused dedication to media literacy, like making journalism less opaque. I think people don't understand really how journalism is made. And it's easy to question why you chose a certain source, not the other one, why this quote, not the other one. People see the end results, but not the process. So kind of wrapping that up, our solution, especially with documenters, tends to be get more people involved in the process. That participatory aspect of you have the informing that journalists do, the engagement that is kind of rising. City Bureau says adequate space. How do we train people? How do we get folks involved in discussion? How do we get them networked so that that longer term view is in focus? The solution, I think, will come from people, not by any one individual organization. Sorry, what was that, Jim?
Engagement and participation and involvement equals trust.
Yeah, I would say so. And documenters will do that. I mean, the kind of the short answer to the question on the election is the same work we've been doing, going to as many meetings, public meetings as we possibly can, and sending documenters there and getting them trained and paid to do that, making all that information public. And so the civic knowledge, the experience of actually participating in government leads to that trust and understanding, that information be distributed in ways that aren't simply led by a news source. I think this is a partnership. You know, there are journalists and there are the people who consume information. That Venn diagram does not have to be a Venn diagram. It can be more of a circle. There can be more partnership between many more people and journalists.
Got it. Thank you. We have I think 10 minutes left till 12:30, and we want to respect people's time and end on time. I have one more probably longer question and then a quick lightning round before we leave, having to do with the presidential election. But those of you on the call, and there are still close to 100 of you, please do chime in the Q&A if we have not yet addressed all your questions or your thoughts. My question is back to what the best possible partnership is between communities and the major legacy news organizations in each of your markets. And I'm talking about Chicago Public Radio, the Chicago Tribune. There once was a great paper called the Oakland Tribune, which no longer exists. Oakland is in effect a news desert surrounded by Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, which is sad. But the Chronicle, the San Jose Mercury News, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, WHYY. I asked Darryl yesterday what his level of optimism was that these organizations could and would become much more community-centered in their coverage and closer to the communities that they serve, which are typically very diverse and getting more so, and young and getting younger. And he said he was not terribly optimistic, frankly, unless there was significant internal and external pressure for change. I can tell you from where I sit, there is significant external and internal pressure for change. How do you think about this? What does the partnership look like between City Bureau and the Chicago Tribune, or the Washington Informer and the Washington Post, or NPR in Washington, et cetera? And Cassie, Tasneem, let's keep it quick because we're running out of time, but
I can keep it quick. I have a real insular comment. I think at base, when you're talking about these legacy institutions, there has to be an acknowledgement of like the fact that the Philadelphia Inquirer, when its mission statement was written however many 100 and some odd years ago, it did not speak for, like they weren't trying to include me, right? Like I'm a Black queer woman. They did not care about meeting my information needs. And so as long as these legacy institutions are still operating with the same set of organizational values, because institutions rarely revisit them, with the same set of, with the same mission, with the same, or without a critical, kind of breaking down of what it means to be a legacy institution in journalism in 2020, because please believe it is not the same thing as when these institutions were founded. Like there isn't, I don't have a lot of hope, right? It's going to take that level of commitment. And so I think, I'll speak for Philadelphia. I think the Inquirer is actually in a position right now where it could do that work, and I think it would be important for an institution to go through that process if we're really talking about equity at the end of the day.
Thank you, Darryl.
Can I jump on this? I love that. Completely agree.
Jump on or pile on?
Maybe pile on.
Okay.
I will posit briefly that most journalism outlets, especially when we talk about the mainstream ones, don't have a theory of change in any real sense. And I think that work needs to be done before we really begin to talk about what are the outcomes, and that's partnership. Like we're going in the same direction. Secondly, I want to go back quickly to equity, and Denise, something that you had said really just reminded me of how much I appreciate what y'all are doing. When I think of equity, I think of ownership. And so City Bureau really is oriented towards that. We do partner with a lot of organizations and get paid for that content, and those partnerships are great, and they're building up the resiliency of the ecosystem. But what I really want to see is more ownership of media organizations by all the folks that have not been invited to the party in the last 200 years. So how do we do that? How do we get to equity? By creating new institutions. I think about Cicero Independiente here in Chicago. I think about Noise in Omaha. So many. Like, let's support that. That's the future.
The principle of, if I may, Tasneem, of Jerry Lenfest donation of the Philadelphia Inquirer and related assets, the Philadelphia Daily News, to a nonprofit is that it is to be a public benefit entity, not beholden to a hedge fund, not beholden to an all-white board, not beholden to a news chain. And as Cassie points out, there is a long way to go, and there's a process underway. But certainly one approach is to take news organizations of scale and convert them. The Salt Lake Tribune has done this. The Tampa Bay Times has done this. Tasneem.
No, Denise, were you jumping in? I actually
I was just going to say quickly, I think one of the things that we're missing in this part of the conversation is the fact that a lot of those legacy publications, including ours, are businesses. You know, we are for-profit businesses. And so, you know, the access to advertisers and trying to, you know, pay bills and generate revenue, a lot of times doesn't, I mean, some consumers are undervalued, you know, so why change your model if I'm trying to reach people who my advertisers don't value? I'm going to stick with those who I know that have money, that have resources, that, you know, buy high end, they do this, they do that. And until I see where I can't survive off of that anymore, then maybe I will change my business model. But in nonprofit journalism is, from what I can see, is a fairly new model, and still not necessarily has it proven itself yet. So I think that's one thing that needs to be taken into consideration.
I'm gonna shift gears since we just have a couple of minutes, with apologies to Tasneem, for a lightning round. And this is about the election, and this is you representing yourselves, not necessarily your organizations, but will Joe Biden and Kamala Harris win the November election? This is a yes or no question. Darryl.
I can't say anything but yes. At this point, no matter how I feel about it, I gotta keep it up.
I think you got a thumbs up from Cassie. Tasneem?
Yeah, what else is there to say?
Yeah. I think at this stage, 4 years ago, we were all viewed Hillary as a shoo-in, and I hope again that we're right. My second and last question is: the election is Tuesday, November 3rd. When will it be called as final? And this is multiple choice. Election Day, Tuesday, November 3rd. Thanksgiving, as Ben Smith said in his recent New York Times article. Inauguration Day, or never. So that's A, B, C, or D. Jump ball.
Let's go with Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
I'm going to give the American people the chance to declare who their president is on whatever day after November 3rd.
Other thoughts?
I'm going to say in court.
Yeah, I'm just hoping it is called.
Right. I think it's Gore v. Bush, you know, on steroids, and it's going to be a long and very, very interesting November. And I would posit that each of you will be at the center of the conversation, that your media will continue to grow in value and in engagement, because your hearts and your minds are in the right place, which is centering your audience and centering your communities. I think we can all learn from you in legacy media and in startup media, and I'm deeply grateful for your work and for this panel. And thank you to Julie and to Tom, who I think will close out.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you all, panelists and everybody who shared these great questions. I feel like we continue this conversation for hours, but out of respect for everyone's time, we're going to stop. This is part of an ongoing conversation, and we hope you'll join us again next week for what would introduce the journalism. The Journalism Institute helped during this challenging time. We've waived all registration fees for programming since March in light of the pandemic, at a savings of more than $52,000 to the thousands of people like you who we've been serving. And we're hoping that you'll give our work a thumbs up with the donation in support of programs like this, and that you'll answer a few questions about your experience today so that we can keep designing programs that serve you and other journalists best. So you'll receive links to do both shortly in an email, along with a link to the recording of this video and information about next week's program. We really appreciate you being here with us, and we hope you will stay well and that we will see you again soon.
Thank you, Julie.